And of course there's Joan. She just shows up to eat. My father said it into the microphone, grinning, and 40 people at the reunion laughed. He'd just spent 2 minutes thanking my brother for bringing us all together and covering today, and now he was pointing his beer at me like I was the punchline he'd been saving. I laughed along because I'd been laughing along at that table for 41 years. What none of them knew was that the food they were eating, the tent over their heads, the caterer standing 20 feet away, I'd paid for all of it. I'd paid for most of it for 9 years. So when the laughter died down, I stood up and I called the caterer over and I asked him one simple question, loud enough for the whole table to hear. What my father didn't know was that the daughter who just shows up to eat was the only reason there was anything to eat at all. The reunion was at the Pine Hollow Lodge, the same rented pavilion my family had used for these things since I was a teenager. White tent, long folding tables, a lake nobody swam in, the smell of barbecue and citronella. Every summer, the Merricks of Easton, Pennsylvania, gathered here to be photographed being a family. My father, Walter, presided over all of it like a small-town king. My brother, Greg, stood at his right hand the way he always had, and I sat where I always sat, toward the end of the table, near the kids, close enough to be counted in the head count, and far enough that nobody had to actually talk to me. I want to tell you about my brother Greg, because you can't understand the caterer moment without understanding Greg. Greg is 2 years older than me, and he has spent his entire life being the one our parents are proud of. Not for anything he did, for existing in the shape they wanted. Greg played quarterback for one mediocre season, and my father told that story for 30 years. Greg got married in a way they approved of, had the grandchildren on schedule, bought the house with the lawn. Greg is, by every visible measure, the family's success. He's also, and I say this without heat, completely broke, and has been for most of a decade. But nobody at that reunion knew that either. Including, in a sense, Greg himself, because the thing about Greg is that he's never had to know what he can't afford. Here's the architecture of my family, and maybe it's the architecture of yours, too. There's the child who's praised and the child who pays. Sometimes they're the same about money, and sometimes they're not, but the roles are always there. Greg was praised. I paid. And the cruelest part of the arrangement was that I paid in secret, which meant I got none of the credit and all of the contempt, and for 9 years I told myself that was love. The roles get assigned so early, you don't even remember the casting. I have a memory from when I was maybe 7. I'd fixed the family VCR, the thing nobody else could figure out, and I remember my mother saying, "Oh, Joan's always been our little helper," and my father, in the same breath, telling a neighbor how Greg had scored a goal in soccer that afternoon. Helper and hero. 7 and 9 years old, and the parts were already cast, and we'd both spend the next 34 years reading the lines we'd been handed in a kitchen we were too young to remember. Greg got to be the one things happened for. I got to be the one who made things happen and was never quite the point. By the time money entered the picture, the roles were so old and so worn that funneling my paycheck through my brother to keep my father proud felt almost natural. Of course the helper helps in secret. That's what a helper is. That's what I'd always been told I was. Let me go back, but only far enough to explain how I ended up writing the checks. 9 years ago, my mother got sick. Not the kind of sick that kills you fast, the kind that drains a family slowly, the kind with co-pays and specialists, and a mortgage that suddenly has nobody healthy enough to keep up with it. My father had retired early, on a pension that looked bigger in 1995 than it did in reality. Greg, the golden child, the success, sat across from me at a kitchen table during the worst week of it, and admitted quietly that he couldn't help. 3 kids, a second mortgage. "I'm tapped out, Joni," he said. "I wish I could." And then He asked me not to tell our parents because it would break Dad's heart to know Greg couldn't step up. I remember that kitchen table exactly. My mother was upstairs sleeping off a treatment. My father was at the pharmacy. And Greg sat across from me with a stack of unopened envelopes between us, the kind with the pink edges. And he put his head in his hands and said the truest thing he'd ever said to me. "I'm supposed to be the one who fixes this," he said. "I'm the son, and I've got nothing, Joni. I'm underwater. If Dad finds out I can't help, it'll kill him. He's so proud of me." He looked up. "You're better with money. You always were. Could you, just for a few months, just until Mom's through the worst of it, could you help and let me be the one who hands it over, so Dad doesn't have to know it's not me?" "A few months." That's what he said. "A few months." I said yes before I'd even finished thinking, because I'd been saying yes to this family my whole life, and yes was the only word I'd ever been thanked for, when I was thanked at all. So I stepped up. Quietly, the way I did everything. The few months became 9 years, and somewhere in there, I stopped noticing I'd agreed to disappear. I'm Joan, and I'm 41 years old, and if you've ever been the one who pays while someone else gets thanked, I think your jaw is already tight because you know this story in your body. Before I tell you what the caterer said back to me, do me one small favor. If you're watching, drop a comment and tell me where you're from and what time it is there, because I genuinely want to know who's out there listening to this with me. And if any of this is hitting close, hit subscribe. Not because I'm asking, but because what my father did 3 weeks after that reunion is the part nobody believes until they hear it. Now, let me get back to that table, because my father had just called me a freeloader into a microphone. The reason I could afford to pay for any of it started a long way from that pavilion. People at that reunion thought they knew what I did. Joan does something with computers. That was the family summary, delivered with a little shrug, the way you describe a hobby. What I actually did was build a company. 12 years ago, I started writing scheduling and logistics software for medical practices out of my apartment, and it turned out a lot of medical practices needed exactly that, and I was good at it, and I was relentless. By the time my mother got sick, my company had 30 employees and a client list that spanned 4 states. By the reunion I'm telling you about, it had grown into something I don't even like to say out loud at family events, because the number makes people's faces do a thing I don't enjoy. There was a moment, early on, when I almost told them. The company had just landed its first big hospital network, the contract that turned my apartment operation into a real business, and I drove home to Easton that weekend, buzzing with it, certain that this was the thing that would finally make them see me. I sat at the dinner table with the news on the tip of my tongue all evening. And then, my father spent 20 minutes telling everyone about a sales award Greg had won. A small thing, a plaque from a regional dealership. And the way his face lit up doing it, the pride pouring off him. I just couldn't. Not because I was afraid they'd be jealous, because I knew, with a certainty that sat in my stomach like a stone, that whatever I said next would be received as me trying to compete with Greg's plaque. The golden child got pride for a plaque. The other one got suspicion for a hospital network. So I ate my dinner and said nothing, and on the drive back to the city, I cried, and I didn't fully understand why until years later. I never told them after that. And I want to be honest about why, because it's not a flattering reason. Part of it was that Greg asked me to keep his finances secret, and once you're keeping one secret in a family, the others stack on top of it naturally. But the bigger part was this. Some broken piece of me believed that if they knew, they'd love me for it, and I didn't want to be loved for it. I wanted to be loved for me, the actual me, the one who'd sat near the kids' table for 40 years. And so I ran a quiet experiment that lasted 9 years. I paid for everything. said nothing, and waited to see if anyone would ever turn to me at that table and ask who I was, instead of assuming they already knew. Nobody ever asked, they just ate. Let me tell you how the paying actually worked, because the mechanics matter for what happened with the caterer. After my mother got sick, I started covering the gaps, the mortgage shortfall, the medical copays. Then, when she recovered, she did recover, slowly. It didn't stop, because by then, my parents had gotten used to a standard of living that their actual income couldn't support, and unwinding that would have meant admitting where the money came from. So I kept it going. But here's the thing I did that I'm not proud of, and that set the whole trap. To protect my father's pride, I didn't send the money to my parents directly. I sent it through Greg. Every month, money went from me to Greg, and Greg passed it to our parents, and our parents believed it came from Greg, the successful son, taking care of his family. I built that fiction with my own hands. I funded my brother's reputation as the family provider with money he never earned, because 9 years ago I decided my father's pride mattered more than my own name. I had a spreadsheet. I want to tell you about the spreadsheet because it's the thing that made me understand, eventually, how much of myself I'd been quietly handing over. I'm a logistics person by trade. I build systems that track where things go. And so without quite meaning to, I'd built one to track where I went. 9 years of rows, the mortgage gap, month after month, my mother's specialist in Philadelphia. The dental work my father never knew wasn't covered. The roof, 2 winters ago, the car when Greg's transmission died and he couldn't make rent if he fixed it. I never looked at the total. For 9 years, I entered the rows and never once scrolled to the bottom cell, because some part of me knew that if I saw the number, I'd have to ask myself what I was actually buying. I wasn't buying their comfort. I was buying a seat at the table I never got to sit in. And the price of that seat, it turned out, was the seat itself. And the family reunions, the pavilion, the catering, the tent, the whole annual performance of togetherness, those got folded into the same arrangement years ago. Greg organized the reunion. Greg covered it. Everyone thanked Greg. And every single year, the actual invoice came to me, paid from my account through a quiet standing arrangement with the caterer, because Greg handled the booking. But Greg's card had been declining for years, and we both knew it, and we both pretended otherwise. The first year, Greg's card was declined in front of Tom while I stood there, and I quietly handed Tom mine, and Tom, bless him, never made a face. After that, it was simply understood. Greg booked, I paid. The table thanked Greg. 6 years of that, smooth as a machine, because I'd built the machine and I was its only moving part. I want you to understand what 9 years of this actually felt like day to day, because people hear she secretly funded the family and picture something dramatic, some grand monthly gesture. It wasn't. It was a recurring transfer I set up, so I wouldn't have to think about it, the way you set up a utility bill. It was answering a text from Greg. "Hey, Mom's got that appointment, the specialist, can you?" With a thumbs up while I was in a board meeting for my own company. It was sitting at Thanksgiving, listening to my father praise Greg for always being there for your mother, while the receipt for always being there sat in my email inbox, addressed to me. It was the slow, invisible erosion of being a person who is constantly, quietly load-bearing in a house where everyone believes the weight is being carried by someone else. You don't feel it crack you all at once. You feel it the way a floor feels footsteps, a little more bend every year, until one day you realize you've been holding up the whole room and calling it love. The caterer was a man named Tom Delgado, who'd done these reunions for 6 years running. Tom knew. Tom had always known, because Tom is the one who runs my card. That's the detail my father didn't have when he stood up with that microphone. The man 20 feet away, the one my father was about to make me a punchline in front of, was the one person at that entire reunion who knew exactly who paid the bills. I should tell you what that table felt like in the hour before my father stood up, because the contempt didn't start with the microphone. It started the way it always did, in 100 small ways. My sister-in-law, Greg's wife, Pam, leaned over while we were filling plates and said, with the particular sweetness people use when they're being cruel, "It's so good of you to come, Joan. I know these big family things aren't really your scene." As if I were the one who'd never built anything. As if I were the one who'd asked to be kept at the edge. Then my Aunt Lorraine, my father's sister, sat down beside me with her plate and patted my knee. "Still just you, sweetheart. No one special?" she asked. "You know, it's not too late. My friend's son is divorced. Very nice. Drives a truck." I'd heard a version of this every summer since I was 30. The assumption baked into it was always the same, that my life was a thing that hadn't happened yet, a waiting room, an unfinished sentence. That I was someone things needed to be done for, not someone who did things. I smiled and said, the truck-driving son sounded lovely. Then my father drifted by with his beer, in good spirits, holding court the way he did, and he stopped behind my chair and squeezed my shoulder for the benefit of the relatives nearby. "There she is," he said. "My daughter, the homebody. You eating enough, Joni? Greg, make sure your sister gets a plate. She came all this way." A couple of cousins chuckled. He didn't mean it as a knife. That was the thing about my father. He genuinely didn't. He'd built a little comedy bit out of me decades ago. The spinster daughter who shows up for the food, and he ran it the way you run a favorite old joke, fondly, without ever wondering whether the person it was about had grown into someone the joke no longer fit. I'd built a company that met a payroll for 90 families every 2 weeks. To him, I was still the quiet girl at the end of the table who needed reminding to eat. I watched Greg, 3 seats down, get up to give a toast to our father, glowing, beloved, broke. And then Greg said the line that I think, looking back, was the moment my 9 years quietly ended. "To Dad," Greg said, lifting his beer. "Who taught me that family takes care of family? I try to live up to that every day. It's why I do this." He gestured at the tent, the food, the whole reunion, every year, because somebody's got to step up. He smiled at me when he said it. Not cruelly, worse than cruelly, generously, the way you smile at someone you've decided to be patient with. Somebody's got to be the one who takes care of everybody. 40 people raised their beers to my brother for the gift I had bought. I raised mine too. I want you to know that. I lifted my drink to Greg, taking credit for 9 years of my money, and I smiled, and the heat came up behind my eyes the way it always did, the old familiar pressure of swallowing it. And then my father, beaming, took the microphone from Greg and thanked him again. "For bringing us all together and covering today, my son, the one who steps up." And then his eyes found me at the end of the table and softened into that almost kind expression that is so much worse than anger. And he said it. "And of course there's Joan. She just shows up to eat." The laugh that followed was the warm kind. The harmless kind. The kind that comes from people who think they're in on a joke and don't know they're standing on someone. And for the first time in 41 years, I didn't make myself smaller to fit under it. I want to pause here for 1 second, because if you've made it this far, you already understand something 40 people at that reunion didn't. You know what it costs to hold your face still while your own father turns you into a punchline. If you've ever been the one who quietly carries a family and gets called a freeloader for it, then I'm talking to you, and I'd love for you to tell me in the comments where you were when it happened to you. And if you want to know exactly what I asked Tom Delgado in front of that whole table, stay with me, because this is where the woman who just shows up to eat stopped showing up quietly. I stood up. I didn't stand up angry. That's the part people don't expect. I stood up the way you stand up when something that's been bent for 40 years finally straightens, slow and certain, and a few heads turned because the freeloader wasn't supposed to do anything but laugh. I set my drink down, and I looked across the tent at Tom, who was standing by the serving table with his clipboard. And I raised my voice, the calm, clear voice I'd spent 40 years keeping small. "Tom," I said, "sorry to interrupt. Quick question while everybody's here." I smiled at him. Friendly, easy. "The balance for today, the tent, the catering, all of it. Whose card did you want me to settle that on? Same one as always, or are we splitting it this year?" The tent went quiet in a way that a tent full of 40 eating people does not normally go. Tom looked at me, and Tom is a good man, and I watched him understand in real time that something was happening here that was bigger than an invoice. He glanced at my father, at Greg, then back at me. "Same card as always is fine, Ms. Merrick," he said carefully. "Yours is on file. It's been on file every year." A beat. "Did you want the receipt now, or should I email it like usual?" Like usual. You could have heard the lake from inside that tent. 40 people who had just toasted my brother for covering today sat with their forks halfway up, recalculating. My father's grin was still on his face, but it had stopped meaning anything. Frozen there like a photograph of a feeling he was no longer having. And Greg had gone the specific gray of a man, watching a story he's told for years, come apart at the seams in front of everyone he's ever told it to. "Email's fine, Tom," I said. "Thank you. The food's wonderful, as always." I sat back down. I didn't say another word. I didn't have to. Tom went back to his clipboard, and the silence did the rest, because the silence had 9 years of receipts in it. My father found his voice first. "Joan. Just my name, the way you say a name when you've lost your footing." What does he mean? Your card?" "He means exactly what he said, Dad," I said quietly. "It's on file. It's been on file every year." I picked up my fork. Enjoy the reunion. Greg threw a beautiful party. Around the table, the recalculation was happening in real time, and I could watch it move from face to face like wind crossing a field. Aunt Lorraine, who'd offered me the truck-driving bachelor an hour earlier, was staring at me as though I'd changed shape in my chair. Pam had gone very still beside Greg, her hand frozen on her wine glass. A cousin leaned to another cousin and whispered something, and the whisper started traveling, the way whispers do, table to table, until the whole tent was a low hum of people trying to fit a new fact into an old picture and finding it didn't go. The freeloader pays. The one who shows up to eat is the one who bought the food. 9 years of a story coming apart over a caterer's clipboard. Nobody laughed now. That was the part I noticed most. An hour ago they'd laughed so easily, the warm, harmless laugh, and now not one of them could find it, because the joke only worked as long as I was who they'd decided I was, and Tom had just told them, in 11 words, that I never had been. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. I didn't. I felt the floor of 40 years drop out, and I felt the strange grief of watching my father's face try to hold a picture of his family that was no longer true. And I felt, underneath all of it, a relief so total it scared me. Because the secret was out, and I hadn't even had to be cruel to spill it. I'd just answered a caterer's standard question, honestly, in public, for the first time in 9 years. Greg got to me before anyone else, by the parking area, his face working. "What was that?" he hissed. "What the hell was that? In front of everyone, you couldn't have... Joan, you made me look like..." "Like what, Greg?" I said. "Finish it." "Like I don't pay for my own family's reunion." "You don't," I said. I said it gently, because there was no point saying it any other way. You haven't paid for one of these in 6 years. You haven't paid the mortgage gap in 9. Every dollar that's gone to Mom and Dad with your name on it came from me, through you, because you asked me to keep it secret, so Dad wouldn't be ashamed of you. I watched that land. I did that. I protected you. For 9 years, I let you be the one who steps up, with my money, And I sat at the kids' table and let Dad call me a freeloader, and I told myself it was worth it, because at least the family was okay. My voice didn't shake, and I was proud of that. And then you stood up tonight and gave a toast about how somebody's got to take care of everybody. And you smiled at me when you said it. Greg's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You don't understand," Greg said, and his voice had climbed, panic in it now. "Everyone's looking at me and they're like, Dad's going to... Do you know what this does to me? Do you have any idea what you just took from me?" And there it was. Even now, with the truth standing between us in a gravel parking lot, his first instinct was the same as it had always been, that the cost that mattered was the cost to him. That I'd taken something from Greg rather than finally stopped giving. "I know exactly what I took from you," I said, and I kept my voice gentle, because cruelty wasn't the point and never had been. "I took a story where you're the one who takes care of everybody. It was a beautiful story, Greg. I should know. I wrote it. I funded every word of it for 9 years. I looked at my brother, at the man our family had spent 4 decades being proud of, and I felt something closer to grief than anger. I'm not angry that you're broke. Being broke isn't a crime. I'm not even angry that I paid. I chose that. What I'm done with, Greg, is paying for the privilege of being the family disappointment. I bought you a reputation, and I bought myself a punchline, and tonight, I just stopped buying both." I picked up my keys. That's the part I'm not doing anymore. I left the reunion before dessert. Nobody walked me to my car. I sat behind the wheel for a minute before I started it, and through the tent's open side, I could see them all still sitting there. My whole family, around a table I'd set for 9 years, finally seeing the empty chair at the end of it for what it was. My phone started buzzing before I got to the highway. Not from my father. He was too proud and too shaken, and I think too busy doing math he didn't want to finish. The texts came from everyone else, and they came in the shape they always came in. The family machine already building its narrative. From Pam. "That was so cruel, Joan. Humiliating Greg like that in front of the kids." From Aunt Lorraine. "Your father is beside himself. Was that really necessary, dear?" From a cousin I barely knew. "Heard you made a scene at the reunion?" The story was writing itself, the same one it always did. The difficult daughter, the one who couldn't just let the family have a nice day. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove. Then it rang with a number I did have saved, Tom Delgado. "Ms. Merrick," he said. I hope I didn't speak out of turn back there. I could tell something was... I just answered the question. "I've run your card for 6 years. I assumed everybody knew." "You didn't speak out of turn, Tom," I said. "You told the truth. You're maybe the only one there who did all night." I felt my throat tighten. "Send me the receipt like usual. And Tom, thank you for knowing and never making it weird. That meant more than you'll ever know." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "For what it's worth, ma'am, every year I watched you pay for that whole family and sit way down at the end of the table. I always wondered when somebody was going to thank you." A pause. "Looks like you finally did it yourself." I had to pull over after that one. Because a man I'd hired 6 times, a man whose last name I'd had to double-check on this year's contract, had seen me more clearly in 6 summers than my own family had in 41 years. He'd watched the woman who paid set at the children's end of the table, and unlike everyone who shared my blood, he'd noticed, he'd wondered. The not being seen had never been about whether I was visible. I'd been standing right there, paying, every year. It was about who was willing to look. My family had chosen, year after year, not to. And a caterer with a clipboard, who owed me nothing, had chosen to see me anyway. That's the thing that broke me on the side of that highway, not the cruelty of the people who didn't look, but the simple kindness of the one stranger who did. I want to stop here for a moment because I think some of you are exactly where I was in that car. You finally said the true thing out loud after years of swallowing it, and instead of feeling powerful, you feel raw and shaky and a little sick, and you don't understand why telling the truth doesn't feel better than the lie did. I didn't either. Not for weeks. Here's what I think now. The lie was comfortable because it was familiar, and the truth was terrifying because it meant I could no longer hide behind being the good, quiet one. As long as I was paying in secret, I got to be a martyr, and martyrs never have to find out if they'd be loved without the sacrifice. Standing up took that away. It made me a whole person with needs, in front of everyone, and that is so much scarier than being a saint nobody sees. If you've ever finally stood up and named what everyone refused to see, and then sat in your car and shook, drop a comment and tell me. Tell me what you stopped paying for, in whatever form you were paying. I read everyone. And if you want to know whether my father ever actually understood what he'd done, stay with me, because he called me 3 days later, and it was not the conversation either of us expected to have. Greg called first, 2 days after the reunion, late, his voice wrecked. I told them, he said. No hello. Mom and Dad, I told them everything. I couldn't. After the caterer, Dad kept asking me what the card thing was, and I tried to lie, Joan. I swear I tried. And I just couldn't keep it up anymore. I'm so tired. A long, shaking breath. I told them I've been broke for years. I told them the money's been coming from you. All of it. The whole 9 years. I sat very still in my kitchen. Dad didn't say anything for like a full minute, Greg said. He just sat there, and then he asked me how much. Total, over the years. And I added it up for him, Joan. I actually did the math out loud. And when I said the number, Mom started crying, and Dad got up and left the room. His voice broke completely. I've spent 9 years letting everybody thank me for being a good son, and the whole time, the good one was sitting at the end of the table getting called a freeloader. By me too. I did it too. At the toast, I smiled at you. You did, I said. There's more? Greg said, and his voice dropped. After you left, Dad didn't say anything for a long time. And then Aunt Lorraine, she said out loud in front of everyone. Well, somebody should have known. Joan always was the one with her head down doing the real work. And nobody argued with her, Joan. That's the thing. Nobody said no, that's not true. They all just sat there, because suddenly everyone remembered it differently. Everyone remembered that you were always the one who handled things. It's like the whole family had been pretending not to know, and the caterer just made it so they couldn't pretend anymore. He exhaled, shaky. I think part of all of them always knew. They just liked the other story better. We all did. I sat with that for a second. The whole family had liked the other story better. There it was, the cleanest description of 41 years anyone had ever given me, and it came from my broke brother at midnight, 3 days too late and a lifetime too late, and somehow exactly on time. Why did you let me? He asked. Why did you protect me for 9 years and let them treat you like that? I don't understand. You could have stopped any time. You could have just told them. And here's the answer I gave my brother, because it was true, and because it was the first honest conversation we'd had in our entire lives. Because I thought if I just kept the family okay, eventually somebody would see me, I said. I thought love was something you earn by carrying things. So I carried everything, and I waited. And nobody ever asked who I was, Greg. Not once in 9 years did anyone at that table turn to me and ask me a single real question about my own life. They just assumed they already knew. And it was easier to keep paying than to find out that the version of me they'd decided on at the kids' table was the only version they'd ever want. I exhaled. I didn't protect you because you deserved it. I protected the idea that if I was good enough, quiet enough, useful enough, this family would finally choose me. That's not generosity. That's a wound with a checkbook. Greg was quiet a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. 9 years late, and more than that, a lifetime late. "I didn't know I was standing on you," he said. "I swear to God I didn't. I thought that's just where you like to sit." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I thought that's just where you like to sit. That's the thing about being the one who carries a family. The people you carry don't feel the weight. They just think you're naturally low to the ground. My father called the 3rd day. I let it ring twice. Then I answered, and I sat down, because I'd been waiting 41 years for this conversation, and I wanted to be sitting for it. "Joan." His voice was wrong, not the booming microphone warmth. Something stripped down to the studs. "Greg told us about the money, about all of it." "Okay," I said. "Is it true?" 9 years. A pause where I heard him not wanting it to be. "The mortgage, your mother's medical bills, the reunions, the card, all of it was you." "Yes." "No," he said, the reflex, the immediate door closing. "No. Greg's been taking care of us. He's been the one who steps up. He told me himself. Every year Greg passed you my money, Dad," I said. "Every month. I sent it to him, and he gave it to you because I asked him to. So you wouldn't be ashamed that your son couldn't cover his own family. I built that lie to protect your pride. Tom Delgado has run my card for 6 years. Call him. He'll tell you." "That can't be right," he said, but the certainty was already leaving his voice. "Greg has a good job. Greg's done well. He bought the house. Greg has a second mortgage and 3 kids and a transmission I replaced 2 winters ago," I said. "Call the mortgage company if you don't believe me. Ask Pam. Ask Greg himself. He already told you, Dad. That's why you left the room when you heard the number." I let that sit. Ask anyone except the version of this family that lives in your head, because that version decided who I was 40 years ago and never once checked again. The silence that came back was a different kind. Not denial anymore. The sound of a man watching the central story of his own family fall apart, brick by brick, in real time. "Your mother's surgery," he said faintly. 3 years ago. The one Greg paid for. The one I gave a speech at Thanksgiving about how proud I was of my son for... That was me, Dad. A sound came out of him I'd never heard my father make. "I stood up at my own table," he said slowly, "and thanked your brother for saving your mother's life. With your money. While you sat there." He stopped. "And then last week I picked up a microphone and told 40 people, you just show up to eat." "Yes," I said, "you did." I'd planned a speech, somewhere in the back of my mind, over 9 years. The cold, devastating thing I'd say, the receipts I'd lay out one by one until he finally understood. And sitting there, with the phone against my ear, I let all of it go, because it wasn't a speech I wanted. It was the answer to the only question that had ever actually mattered. "Why was I never enough, Dad?" I said. My voice stayed level, but it was bare, all the way to the bottom. "Not the money. Forget the money. I'm asking about before the money, when I was a kid at the end of the table. Greg threw one good pass in high school, and you told the story for 30 years. I built a company that employs 90 people, and you've never once asked me what I do. Why? I'm 41. I think I've earned the truth. Why was Greg always the one? And I was always the joke." The silence went on so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Because Greg was easy," my father finally said. "He wanted what I wanted him to want. The football, the wife, the house down the street. You. You were always somewhere I couldn't follow. Reading things I didn't understand. Building things I couldn't picture, and instead of being proud, I think I was. Joan, I think I was scared. You made me feel stupid, and I didn't have the words for it, so I made you the joke instead, because a joke can't make you feel small." His voice cracked. "That's not a reason. I know it's not a reason. It's just the truth. I was a small man who was frightened of his own daughter, So I spent 40 years pretending she was nothing, and she was paying for my whole life the entire time. I'd waited 41 years for a reason, and the reason was small and human, and nowhere near big enough to cover the size of what it had done. They never are. The wound is enormous, and the reason is always small. That's the thing nobody warns you about. You spend decades imagining that if you ever got the explanation, it would be proportional to the damage. Some grand betrayal, some terrible thing that would at least make the size of your hurt make sense. And then you finally get it, and it's just a frightened man who didn't have the vocabulary for a daughter who outgrew him, so he made her small so he wouldn't have to feel small himself. 40 years of being a punchline, and the reason was that my father got nervous around a smart girl. It would be funny if it weren't the whole shape of my life. "You know what the worst part is?" my father said very quietly into the silence. "It worked. For 40 years it worked. You stayed small enough that I never had to feel it. And the one time you finally stood up, at the reunion with the caterer, my first thought, God forgive me, my actual first thought wasn't, what have I done to her? It was, how dare she embarrass me?" He let out a breath that shook. "That's who I've been, Joan. That's the man you've been paying for." "I don't know what to do with that," I said honestly. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "You don't owe me a thing. You especially don't owe me forgiveness." A long breath. "I'm going to pay you back. I don't know how, on what I've got, but I'm going to—" "I don't want the money back, Dad," I said. That was never what this was about. I gave it freely. I'd give it again. What I want, I can't get with a check, and neither can you. What I want is to never again be the person you point at to get a laugh. That's the whole thing. That's all I ever wanted. I set boundaries with my family after that, and I want to be specific about what they were, because boundaries aren't revenge, and people always confuse the two. Revenge is something you do to someone. A boundary is something you do for yourself. The caterer moment looked like revenge to 40 people in that tent, but it wasn't. It was the first sentence of a boundary I should have drawn 9 years earlier, the night Greg asked me to keep his secret at that kitchen table. I didn't cut anyone off. I considered it, the clean break, the silence, the door shut for good. It would have been more than fair, but I'd watched my family solve its discomfort by erasing a person my whole life, and I didn't want to become fluent in their only language. So I chose terms instead. First, the money. I told them plainly that the secret funding was over, not as punishment, as honesty. I'd realized something writing in that spreadsheet at midnight, scrolling at last to the bottom cell I'd avoided for 9 years. I hadn't been generous. I'd been hiding. Real generosity has your name on it and asks nothing in return. What I'd been doing had my name scrubbed off it and was secretly asking for the one thing money can't buy, to finally be chosen. That's not a gift. That's a ransom you pay to your own family for love. And it never works, because the people taking the money never even know there's a hostage. So, if the family could afford its lifestyle, it would keep it. If it couldn't, then it never really could. And 9 years of my checks had only hidden that from people who needed to know it. I'd help my mother with genuine medical needs directly, in the open, with my name on it, as a daughter and not as a ghost. Because that help was love. And love isn't a thing I'm willing to stop doing. But the reunions, the lifestyle, the mortgage on a standard of living nobody actually earned, that was done. And Greg would never again be handed my money to launder into a reputation. If Greg wanted to be the man who steps up, he could go find out whether he was. As it turned out, he wanted to. As it turned out, he was. But that was his to discover, not mine to buy for him. Second, the story. I told my father he didn't get to narrate me anymore. Not to the family, not to the reunion, not to himself. He'd lost the right to the easy version of me, the one who showed up and laughed and absorbed the joke. If he wanted a relationship with me at all, it would start at 0, with him learning who I actually was at 41, like a stranger, because that's what we were. He asked, in a small voice, whether I could forgive him. And I told him the truest thing I had. "I don't know," I said. "But I won't lie to make it easier, because lying to make things easier is the whole disease of this family, and I'm the one who's going to stop." He was quiet, then he said, "That's fair." It was the first time in my life my father had ever conceded a point to me. There was a fallout I didn't plan. In a family like mine, news travels through phone trees and church parking lots faster than any announcement. 40 people had been in that tent when my father called me a freeloader, and Tom said my card was on file. Within a week, every one of them knew. And you can imagine how the story rearranged itself. Did you hear about Walter Merrick? Called his own daughter a freeloader at the reunion she's been secretly paying for 9 years. Turns out, the quiet one carried the whole family. Always wondered about that. I didn't spread a word of it. I didn't have to. The truth has legs of its own, and it walked through every kitchen in Easton without my help. I'll tell you the strangest part of the fallout, because it taught me something. The people who'd spent years being faintly condescending to me got quiet. Pam stopped emailing, Aunt Lorraine called to apologize, mortified, and I noticed she didn't offer to set me up with anyone this time. But it was the cousins, the ones I'd barely spoken to, who surprised me. 2 of them reached out separately to tell me their own versions of the same story. The sibling who got all the praise, the one who quietly held things together, and got nothing. "I always knew you were the one who actually did stuff," one of them wrote. "I'm sorry I never said it." It turns out almost every family has a Joan, sitting somewhere near the end of the table, and the people who recognized me weren't the ones who'd benefited from the arrangement. They were the other Joans. We know each other on sight, it turns out, even after we've spent our whole lives being told we're invisible. The family's whole picture of itself had a hole in it now, in the exact shape of the daughter they'd kept at the end of the table. And through that hole, for the first time, a few people could actually see me. I want to stop here once more, because I think this is the part that matters most. If you're still with me, thank you. This isn't easy to tell. If this story has made you think about your own family, about the role you got assigned before you were old enough to argue, about the caring you've done that nobody named, then I'd ask you to do one thing. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been the one who pays and gets called the freeloader? I read every single one, and I think a lot of us need to know we weren't the only one at the end of that table. Now, let me tell you how it ended, because it didn't end the way the family expected. Greg changed first. I didn't expect that. The Monday after he told our parents, he called me and actually asked, for the first time in his life, for help. Not money. Help. "I don't know how to not be broke," he said. "I've spent my whole adult life with a safety net I didn't know was a person. I want to learn how to actually stand up. Will you teach me?" I almost said no. I want to be honest about that. There's a version of me, the one 9 years of this had built, that wanted to say, figure it out yourself, the way I had to, the way I always did. But I'd promised myself I wasn't going to become fluent in my family's only language, and their language was punishment, dressed as fairness. So I said yes. A different yes than the old one. Not the yes that disappears me, the yes that asks something back. "I'll help you learn it," I told him. "I won't do it for you. And the first thing you're going to do is tell Pam the real numbers and stop running the same lie on your own marriage that we ran on Dad." There was a long silence. Then he said, "Okay. Yeah, okay." And so I did. Not by giving him anything, but by sitting with him and his real numbers. The way Tom had sat with my receipts for 6 years, honest and unflinching. We built him a spreadsheet, a real one, with the bottom cell visible this time, no row left unscrolled. It turns out my brother, freed from the lie that he was already a success, is a more decent man than the golden child ever was. He got a second job driving for a parts distributor. He sold the house with the lawn and moved his family into something they could actually afford. And the strangest thing happened. He seemed lighter, like the house had been heavier than he'd ever admitted. He calls me on Sundays now, and last month he covered a family dinner. A small one, just the 4 of us, with his own money, his own card, no laundering, no me behind the curtain. The card went through on the first try. He looked at the receipt for a second, like it was a diploma. I paid for that, Joan. Me. It felt incredible. Me. It. It wasn't much money. It was everything. My father's still trying. Some weeks I believe him. Some weeks I don't. That's allowed, too. He drove up to see my office a couple of months after the reunion. The first time in 12 years he'd set foot in any part of my actual life. He stood in the lobby and read the names on the wall, the awards, the framed thing from the Medical Association, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 90 people work here. Not a question, just a man saying a fact out loud to see if he could make himself believe it. 90 families, I said, every 2 weeks. He nodded slowly, and his chin did something, and he turned away so I wouldn't see his face do the thing it was doing. He never apologized for the microphone in so many words. My father. He's not a man who has those words. But he stood in the building his freeloader daughter built and let it be true. And for him, I've come to understand, that was the apology. He started asking me questions after that, clumsy at first, like a man learning a language 40 years too late. What does the software actually do? What were you always reading as a kid that I never understood? Who are you, Joan? Really? The question I'd waited 41 years to hear, asked badly, asked humbly, asked at last. The boundary isn't that he's redeemed. The boundary is that I no longer need him to be, in order to be whole. My mother and I had a conversation too, and I'll tell you about it because it was the one I didn't see coming. She called me a month after the reunion, and she didn't make excuses, which is more than my father managed. She just said, I knew. 3 words, and then a long silence. Not the details, not the spreadsheet. But a mother knows when a thing doesn't add up, and I let myself not know, because knowing would have meant looking at what we were doing to you. I'm the one who should have looked, Joan. I was your mother. I was the one person whose whole job was to see you, and I let your father turn you into a joke because it was easier than the truth. Which was that we were leaning on you so hard you disappeared. She started to cry. You paid for my surgery. You saved my life and let your brother be thanked for it because you didn't think we'd let you save it if you asked. What kind of mother makes her child believe that? I didn't have an answer for her, but I noticed she was the only one who'd asked the question about herself instead of about me. That counted for something. It still does. I started seeing a therapist a few weeks after the reunion, not because I was falling apart, because I'd finally told the truth and it hadn't fixed the ache, and I wanted to understand why. And what she helped me see was the thing I'd been circling for 9 years. I'd built my whole life as an answer to a family that never asked the question. I paid and paid, waiting to be chosen. And the problem with living as an answer to people is that they stay the ones holding the question. My money was never going to make my father ask who I was. I had to stop needing him too. We spent a whole session on that single sentence. You can't buy your way out of a wound that's about not being seen, because every dollar you spend in secret just makes you more invisible. The very thing I was doing to be chosen was the thing guaranteeing I never would be. That's why I put my name on everything now. The help to my mother, the company, the receipts. Not so they'd finally see me. So I'd finally stop hiding from myself. We did have another reunion, the next summer, at the same pavilion with the lake nobody swims in, smaller this time. Greg organized it, and Greg paid for it. Actually paid, his card, his money, and when Tom ran it at the end of the night, it went through clean, and Greg caught my eye across the tent and gave me a little nod that contained 9 years in it. My father didn't give a speech. He'd retired the microphone, I think on purpose. And I didn't sit at the end of the table. I sat in the middle, where I'd put myself, and when my Aunt Lorraine started to say something about my being single, I just looked at her, calmly, and she stopped, and smiled, and asked me instead how the company was doing. It's a small thing, where you sit at a table. It's also the whole thing. So here's what I know now, and it's the only thing I really came here to say. The people who call you a freeloader are often the ones standing on your shoulders. The caring you do in silence doesn't earn you a seat at the table. It just teaches everyone that you'll carry. And you are allowed to set the weight down. You are allowed to stand up at the reunion. Finally. And ask the question out loud, not to humiliate anyone, but because you deserve to be seen as exactly who you are. Not the one who shows up to eat, but the one who made sure there was anything on the table at all. If you've ever been the one who pays and gets called the freeloader, the one at the end of the table, the joke they saved for the microphone, I see you. I was you. And I promise you, the day you stop paying for the privilege of being their disappointment is the day you finally find out who you were the whole time. Thank you for staying with me. If your own family ever made you the punchline while you quietly held the whole thing up, tell me about it below. I read everyone, and none of us should have to sit at that end of the table thinking we're the only one. Subscribe if you want more of these, and remember this if you remember nothing else. You were never the freeloader. You were the foundation. They just never looked down to see what they were standing on. This is Joan, and for the first time in 41 years, I'm not paying to be loved anymore.